Hi everyone, this is For the Love of Comics and a very warm welcome to another episode in which we do a Tintin edition comparison. Today we'll be looking at the Blue Lotus in both its original version from 1935-1936 as well as the colored and redrawn edition from 1945, usually the version most people are familiar with. I say another because I do have a collection of such edition comparisons. I've done one for The Black Island, Tintin in America, and Cigars of the Pharaoh, and I'll link the playlist at the end of this video and in the description below. I've also earlier looked at the Blue Lotus in a slightly different edition, a 2-in-1 edition, The Making of Tintin, which included both Cigars of the Pharaoh and the Blue Lotus, and I'll have that link below in the video description as well. To those videos, today we add this look at the Blue Lotus, which was the 5th Tintin adventure following Tintin in the Land of the Soviets, Tintin in the Congo, Tintin in America, and Cigars of the Pharaoh, and is for many people their favorite Tintin adventure and is widely considered amongst most people to be Hergé's first true masterpiece in the Tintin series of adventures. This high regard of it is due to a number of factors, including a more complex and politically aware or activistic story, a tone of anti-colonialism, anti-racism that was new to the series, although we had seen hints of it before, a crackling adventure whose plot held together really well instead of the more episodic adventures that we'd seen so far, in which Tintin sort of just stumbles from one mishap or adventure to another that were only loosely connected. The Blue Lotus featured dozens of characters who intersected with each other. There was also the incredible level of detail and authentic feeling artwork, especially in the depiction of Asian signage and architecture. And the Blue Lotus also featured Tintin as a far more empathetic character, someone who has empathy for other characters, someone who makes moral choices. All of these and more combined to give this book its sterling reputation. The Blue Lotus was famously created by Hergé out of a fascination for China, but also a friendship that he developed, a friendship that he represented over here through the character of Chang. And at first glance through this facsimile from Casterman, this facsimile of the original 1935-36 edition, a casual glance through it shows us that there's not really that much different in the redrawn version, at least on a panel-by-panel basis. You have a couple of significant things for sure, just like we've seen in earlier facsimile editions. This one does reproduce full color plates that Hergé created for the collected edition after the story had finished serialization. This is the first of those color plates, this is the second one, and this is the third. Other than these color plates, what the facsimile edition shows us is just what kind of editing and trimming was done to the originally 128-page story down to the more familiar 62-page version. We can see that the early figure work has definitely been adjusted to match Hergé's more evolved drawing style. But you can see that the panels are strikingly similar. They've just been shrunken down again so that more of them fit on the page. But the action that's happening within them, the pacing apart from the shrinking, is very, very much the same. There are some pacing edits, like this sequence over here has 3 panels where you have someone coming and saying, "Tintin Sahib," and he says, "Yes, what is it?" And then he says, "The Maharaja would like to see you," and he says, "That's fine, I'm coming." And this takes 3 panels over here. And this entire conversation is condensed into a single panel in the redrawn version. Then we see something that's sort of a hybrid where 2 smaller and separate panels have been conflated into a single panel with the introduction of the fakir over here, but the fakir's performance remains exactly the same on a panel by panel basis. Tintin's reaction to the Maharaja remains 1 panel, although in the redrawn version the Maharaja does reply, and the subsequent telling of the fortune is again absolutely the same panel by panel. So it's essentially 2 pages with slight alterations being condensed into one. And that's because the redrawings for the most focused on background elements and details, embellishments to the panels rather than absolutely redrawing and restructuring everything. So the rather blank and plain looking backgrounds and walls of the palace are filled in over here with artwork and architecture. And even where background detail existed, like this rather nondescript anonymous shrubbery in the background, even where it existed in the original version, in the redrawn version, you have a lot more localized detail with temple architecture and palm trees, things that locate you more in the kingdom of Guy Pajama in India. This is perhaps most obvious and striking when he gets to China. We have first a little bit of editing where these 3 panels of him traveling to China, first by train, then by boat, and then the track across the map. This is something that existed in the original between his departure from Guy Pajama and his arrival in Shanghai. In the redrawn version, you don't have those panels. You go straight from his departure to his arrival in Shanghai, and I think it works really well. It also helps tighten up the story. And while I appreciate most of these edits, there is one thing that I'll have to note. Earlier, when they're hunting for Snowy, Tintin sends the guards one way and heads in the other direction, and this is a pretty good panel, but in the original, you also had a guard in the background yelling Snowy, which I thought was hilarious and wish had been retained. Once Tintin is in Shanghai, he takes a rickshaw to get to a meeting, and in the original, between him taking the rickshaw and the accident in which he intervenes, there's only this small panel with a small street sign. In the redrawn version, this small panel became this one of the most iconic and beloved images, I would say, from this series. The sprawl of the marketplace, the signage, the architecture, and the road layout, all of these are things that are more than embellishments, I would say. This is a major revision to something like this, and whether it was Hergé or his assistants at his studio, this is a marvelous edition and adaptation of this earlier work. So while a number of other things may seem more or less the same but being cosmetically altered by greater background detail, you also have things like this that really conjure a sense of place and space and make this book, as well as this entire series, of course, famous for being what it is. The racist colonial oppressor represented by Gibbons over here, his interaction with the head of police, Dawson. These are introductions to characters that are almost verbatim the way that they were in the original, including the connection that Tintin makes with the rickshaw driver, which will come back later in the story. In fact, the convolutions of this story are pretty much intact from what they were originally. The way that the Chinese and the Japanese tensions have been portrayed, the depiction of corruption and what Tintin is getting himself into slowly unraveling is almost frame by frame preserved in the redrawn edition. But there are a couple of interesting adjustments or changes. For example, in the original as well as the redrawn edition, Tintin, while running with a gun very responsibly, runs into this guard firing his gun, showing how irresponsible it is, and later is arrested by these Caucasian English or Scot soldiers. Dawson later speaks to one of those policemen, I think, not soldiers, and 3 of them, Caucasian, are sent in to beat Tintin up. In the redrawn version, it is 3 Sikh soldiers or policemen, and because Tintin ran into a Sikh policeman earlier, Dawson actually tells them, he beat up one of your chums last night if you want to have a go at him, sort of thing. So as if they are looking for revenge and he's allowing that to happen, adding another level to the way that corruption actually works, which I think is quite interesting and different from this rather simple, I want you to beat him up of the original version. Of course, in both editions, it is the 3 of them who end up getting beaten up by Tintin behind closed doors. That's something that I've always had a little bit of a question about, but if it was these 3 scrawnier looking guys, then I might have been more willing to buy it, but these guys look pretty tough. So in later adventures of Tintin, this sort of hinting at his superhuman strength or fighting abilities more or less recedes, and it's a little bit more believable that he gets by on his smarts. The encounter and fight sequence remains again more or less the same, just condensed into 2 pages. Another small little detail comes in this sequence, in which, because of the railroad being blown up that Tintin witnessed earlier, something that will come back in very similar form in the Land of Black Gold adventure, after that explosion, the news of it spreads like wildfire, and like wildfire growing in exaggeration. This propaganda machine kicking in and saying, well, it's not as harmless as it actually is, and blowing it out of proportion to such an extent that it becomes the reason that Japan invades China. All of this happening in this sequence is a pretty powerful one, where in less than a page, Hergé takes us from the first news report to the League of Nations speech that Japan makes defending its actions. This has been compared to the sequence in Tintin in America, where the Native American lands are taken over in just the space of a few panels, and I can see that completely because of the sweeping nature of the story. And this is one of those times when it sort of breaks away from Tintin and what he's doing to show the consequences of what happens. That's not very common in the Tintin adventure. So this is a superb sequence. And then after the League of Nations address, after this sequence has ended, you go back to Tintin tied up. So between his capture and the next line of dialogue, all of this stuff has happened, and this book ending is part of what gives this so much power. Over here, what you have is news starting to spread, the propaganda machine kicking in, Tintin still running away, tripping and falling, news spreading, them coming and capturing him. This is perhaps just a little too fast if you think that between this bit of broadcast and this bit of broadcast, he's just tripped and hit the ground. So it doesn't work that well interspersed. And so therefore, I think in the redrawn version, taking all of the Tintin moments and putting them before or after this international upheaval flows a lot more tightly and has a lot more power. This Japanese aggression and who's in power and what's controlled by who starts playing a big part of the story about who can cross a border and who is in cahoots with whom and who does the international police help. And this is there from the very original, where you do have this panel of refugees by barbed wire at a border. The sequence is once again verbatim, except for that one panel at the border, again being blown up and completely redrawn to this, which has not just the architecture and the colors, but the calligraphy, and really stands out in a way which makes it the perfect choice as far as which panel to redraw and adapt more heavily. And just like that border panel and the marketplace panel that we had seen before it, along with those two, another classic image from the Blue Lotus is of Thomson and Thompson drawing a crowd's attention because of their outlandish dress. By the way, this is a very interesting commentary on what Europeans think Chinese dress like and the kind of attention that they grab and how the locals are actually dressed. And this is following on from the sequence in which Chang and Tintin also talk about European preconceived notions and outlandish ideas about China. And while this conversation between Tintin and Chang is more or less intact, just condensed the way that most of this book is, the panel with Thomson and Thompson has been gloriously added to and adjusted. It is remarkable to note that as far as the rest of the scene is concerned, the size of the panel, the layout, the angles, as well as the facial expressions of all the characters, the original is pretty much, again, intact in the redrawn version. What you have is just the additional layers of detail in the shops and the people who are walking around them, a much greater sense of the sort of hustle and bustle of the marketplace that they are disrupting by their presence, as opposed to the rather more anonymous blank walls and foreground of the original. And finally, at the very end, after the rather thrilling climax and rescue, there is an additional scene in the original where there is an extra goon sort of hiding in the closet that they knock out before climbing up the stairs and finding the exit of the tunnel into the Blue Lotus. This extra sequence is completely removed from the redrawn version, and I think it's a good thing. You've already caught the number 1, number 2, number 3 guys in your story. The villains are already apprehended. This random extra goon door slammed on his face in order to complete the circuit doesn't really feel necessary. What is missing in the redrawn version is this full page newspaper spread with a number of different stories pertaining to Tintin and what he has achieved. This newspaper conclusion is once again familiar to us from Tintin in America, and it is present in the redrawn version, but just as a single article in part of a page. There are obviously a dozen small little details that have been changed between these two editions. A number of them are about the embellishment, about the backgrounds. Most of them make the story richer, and then there are a couple that I wish that they had carried over. I hope you enjoyed this quick edition comparison between the 1936 and the 1945 versions of the Blue Lotus. This has been For the Love of Comics, and I'll see you in the next video.